This is part 3 of a 3-part series of the points videos, and it starts with the late Woodland period, AD 350 to 1200. When we think of the late Woodland period, a few things comes to mind. They started making very thin-walled pottery that could be placed directly over a fire. You couldn't do that with some of the earlier pottery that was thick. Also, 600 to 700 AD was a time period that we think that the bow and arrow was beginning to be used. Most people think of the bow and arrow as something that all Indians used, but not so. Up until this point, only the atlat and spear and darts were used. Also during this period, we see the wide use of corn starting about AD 900. One of the first point types of the late Woodland period was a Steuben low. Actually dates back into the middle Woodland period a bit at AD 200, and it goes all the way to 750. But mostly it was used in the late Woodland period. There are two styles here, and that's the reason for the dual names, Steuben and low. The difference being the stem on the low tends to be straighter. The Steubens you find mostly in the western part of the state, mostly in western Illinois, whereas the low you find a lot more in eastern Illinois, particularly in southeastern Illinois. They're a fairly small point, 1.5 inches to 3.5 inches in length. They can go up to 4 inches. The early part of the Steuben lows were probably used as spears with the atlat, and possibly they were a transitional point into the bow and arrow use. They are central Midwest in origin. Next is the Mund-Raymond points, and they tend to be a southern Illinois point and also southwestern Illinois. They are late Woodland, AD 500 to AD 800. They also probably started as an atlat point and possibly transitioned into an arrow point. The example I show here is fairly large and very well made for a Mund-Raymond point. Usually they're a bit smaller and not that well made. They are often thick and spike-like. Usually they're poorly made. They're side-notched, and I found only a few in the Wabash Valley in east central Illinois. As again, I said, most are southern Illinois or southwestern Illinois. Here's the Jack's Reef point, AD 650 to 900 AD. They're a late Woodland point. Note the AD 650. That comes right smack in the middle of the time when we think bows and arrows came into use, from 600 to 700. They are a true arrow point. They weren't used for anything else but arrow points. They're one of the true arrow points, along with the raccoon notched we'll take a look at. We'll look at the Madison, and also another one was the Scalhorn. If I were to use 3 modifiers that describe true arrow points, I would say thin, sharp, and deadly. They're small, 1 to 2 inches in length. These are corner notch points with deep diagonal notches. Notice how those notches come in from the corner. They go in diagonally. They are finely flaked out of some of the best Glacial Till, Platteville Galena, Cobden, Wyandotte, and Burlington. They are thin, thin, thin for the most part. And again, they are thin, sharp, and deadly. You have to handle one of these to realize how much damage one of these things can do. They'll go through the thickest hide, you name it. There's something else. Here we have another one of the true arrow points, the Raccoon Notched, AD 800 to 1200. These are a late Woodland point, obviously. Another of the true arrow points. They're just a little later than the Jack's Reef. And look at the notches. They're not corner notched, but low on the sides. And these notches go straight in, perpendicular to the axis of the point. They are not diagonal. Again, they are thin, sharp, and deadly. Finely flaked from Glacial Till, Platteville Galena are usually the church of choice in my area. They are found statewide, but they're most common in eastern parts of Illinois. You have to handle them to realize how finely made that they are. Here is another true arrow point, the Madison. It's a little bit later. AD 800 all the way up into the 1830s and 1840s as a historic point. So it's late Woodland, Mississippian, and historic periods. These were actually recovered from the Fox Ford of 1730 in McLean County. They are triangular in shape, no notches, 3/4 to an inch and a half in length, although I've found one that was 2 inches long. Very finely flaked, thin, sharp, and deadly. A variety of cherts were used, usually, the Burlington, the Platteville, Galena, and that sort of thing. But a significant number on some sites are out of exotic cherts when compared to either the Jack's Reef or the Raccoon Notch. Once in a while, you will find a Madison out of Flint Ridge material, Knife River, or Jefferson City chert, which is the one depicted here. Why? Well, I don't know, but I'm wondering if during this later time period, if Indians weren't recovering flakes, discarded flakes from earlier cultures that used some of the exotic cherts and use them to make the smaller Madison points. That's just a thought. I don't know that that's true, but you have to remember that Indians found earlier projectile points too, and they sometimes reused them, reshaped them, whatever, or sometimes just carried them around as keepsakes. They were collectors too, just like we were. That's been verified many times by an Indian that was buried, and one case under a person's head was a pouch full of much earlier points that he had apparently found and just saved because he wondered who made these, where did they come from, and all that good kind of stuff. They were just people just like we were with the same kind of thoughts and desires, and just as intelligent as we were, probably more so in many ways. We have to remember that they collected too. Obviously, I think some of them collected waste flakes from earlier cultures and used them to make points of their own liking. Then we go into the middle and upper Mississippian periods from AD 1050 to 1700. And mostly we remember these people, the Mississippian cultures, for how they accumulated wealth. They did this by growing corn, trading, and selling corn to other Indians up and down the larger rivers particularly. Of course, we all know of America's first city, Cahokia, that was not that very long-lived, maybe 350 years or so, but it was just east of St. Louis there in the bottomlands, east side of the Mississippi River. And as many as 30,000 people lived in that Cahokia complex for hundreds of years. It's just amazing what they accomplished. But of course, they disappeared too. What happened to them? All kinds of theories. One is that they just lost their ability to grow corn because of the climate changed a bit, and also because they cleared a lot of the bottomland forests out of there to grow corn, and erosion became a problem. All kinds of theories, but it is one of the most talked about cultures that we know, the Mississippian cultures. Cahokia Points, named after the Cahokia complex there east of St. Louis. AD 900 to AD 1400. Of course, these were Mississippian. Two styles of the usual Cahokia point. One is a die-notched, shown on the right. The other is a tri-notched, shown on the left. They're small, they're exceptionally well made. They're made of very fine materials. Some have called them being made of gemstone materials like agate, jasper, chalcedony, quartzite, and high-quality kaolin. The epicenter of their production is the Cahokia area, although it ranged up and down the larger rivers like the Illinois, Mississippi, and Ohio. For example, just over the line in Indiana is the Angel site. That's a Mississippian site. You're going to find Cahokia Points. In the rest of Illinois, you will find Cahokia Points. In all of my life, I found one true Cahokia Point made out of Mill Creek heat-treated chert. You will also find finely made points that are made out of Burlington and whatever. Very well made, very thin. They have side notches, but I don't think they are Cahokia Points. I think they are late Woodland points, and some of the late Woodland people were copying Cahokia Points. They're not made out of the same heat-treated fine materials that some of the Cahokia Points are made. And you will get a difference of opinion on that, and there are people that will disagree with me, but there are also people that will agree that some of these side-notched triangular points that are very well made out of things like Platteville, Galena, and Burlington are not Cahokia Points, although the shape is Cahokia shape. I'm thinking that they're late Woodland copies. Here we get into some of the really exotic stuff. The Ramey knives, the dance sword Ramey knife cluster. This is a Ramey knife here. The smaller of these are called Ramey knives. The larger are called dance swords. The Ramey knives are probably a little bit earlier, from maybe 1050 to 1450 AD, range in size from 3 to 10 inches. And they have some basal grinding on the bases, upwards on the sides just a little bit. Contrary to that are the dance swords that are larger than that, and the one actually pictured in the book is the Vendeventer sword. I think it's 17.5 inches long. And they're ground in the middle of the sides, and we'll get into that, why that is. But these are a little later, probably AD 1200 to 1400. They tend to be made out of very nice materials. The Ramey knives, a lot of them are made out of a very high quality kaolin chert, as the one pictured here is. We have to compare these to the dance sword. We look at these Ramey knives, and I said they're ground at the base. But the dance swords, which are larger, up to, I think there's actually one 18.25 inches long, they're ground on the sides. And why is that? Here is a shell gorget that was found in Hamilton County, Tennessee. And if you look at this figure, you see these two individuals. They're either dancing together or they're in mortal combat. We can't tell. But look what they're holding in their hands. These large swords. They're holding them in the middle of the sword. In other words, we theorize that these dance swords were ground smooth so that these people, whoever they were, be them warriors or whatever, could hold them. That's the theory. It makes a good story anyway. It is obvious that these Ramey knives and these dance swords are ritual or elite items or paraphernalia. And we probably will never know all of the cultural reasons that these objects were made, the way they were made, and how they were used. It certainly appears that they were ritual items. They were used in some kind of celebrations or mock battles or something of that sort. But they're certainly interesting objects made out of chert. Just briefly, I'll talk about exotic arrow points from the Cahokia complex. They use many materials, styles, and many designs. There are all kinds of theories about what went on here at Cahokia, and to really delve into this, read the book. I would just mention there was one famous Mound 72 cache of these exotic points. There were 3 caches of them, over 1,200 exotic points in there. And here's just some of the kind of point styles that you run into in the caches. The Alba, the Cahokia Binotch, and the Bassett. All of them are out of that area in Madison, St. Clair counties. And notice we put in both Madison and St. Clair County because so many of them were just found right on the border area between the two counties. I should say that these 3 points are not necessarily the classic kind of points that are found in Mound 72. And I don't think, I may be mistaken, but I don't think these were found in Mound 72, the ones that are pictured here. Here is an example of one of the Mound 72 cache points. They're just beautifully made, and look how stylized they are. This is a stylized trinotched. It's made out of kaolin. And I'll tell you, these things are just incredibly beautiful. And I can only imagine how they felt when they uncovered these caches. We go into the historic period. It goes all the way up to 1840. And there's one thing you should remember is that the tribal groups in the Illinois country were aware of and were influenced by Europeans before the Europeans actually got here. And that was through contact that Europeans had with Indians on the East Coast, and the Indians on the East Coast had contact with Indians further west. And that was one way. They knew something was coming. Also, Europeans traded items with Eastern Indians on the East Coast and Indians in the Great Lakes area. And these Indians in turn traded these materials down the line, so to speak, to Indians that never saw Europeans. We call this period of indirect contact the protohistoric period in Illinois. and it goes all the way from 1600 to 1650. At that time, the Indians were probably trading with other Indians, or possibly early French traders whose presence was unrecorded. This is entirely possible. But remember, 1600 to 1650 is a protohistoric period in Illinois. The true historic period probably starts with 1673 when Marquette and Joliet came up the Illinois River. So we have historic points. Most of these were made of iron, brass, copper, and sometimes glass. Some were made by Europeans as trade items. Some were made by the Indians themselves out of scrap metals that they gleaned from barrel rings, wheel hoops, tools, spikes, and the like. The European metal points were made mostly for trade out of stamped metal sheets. These points were never popular in Illinois. For the most part, the Indians preferred the chert points. A couple of possibilities, one being that the chert was actually sharper than the metal points, another being that there was some movement afoot to hang on to the old ways. And if you could carry around chert points that you could make yourself, and you had plenty of chert, but maybe you didn't have as much metal, and maybe you wanted to save that metal for a higher priority item, you thought, why not just keep on using the Madison points made out of chert? Again, I want to reiterate that the value of these points is in the story they have to tell. It's very important, even if you have broken points, particularly the hafted, the bottom half of the point. Record and save the provenance. It's this information that will help us track down some really cold cases in Illinois. You know, if we can track a particular cultural period point, and even more so, some of the clans within that culture that used a very stylized type of point, we can tell where these people were, you know, even if it was 6,000 or 7,000 or 8,000 years ago. These points are very, very valuable in that there are so many of them. I mean, there have been thousands upon thousands, literally millions lost all over the United States. They represent cultural icons, and they're so valuable in that respect. So if you have a collection of points, if your granddad had a collection of points that he willed you, and you know they came off a particular farm, record that information and make sure you have a reliable place to have that information recorded for posterity, like the Illinois State Archaeological Survey. Because it's just, if we lose that, we've lost part of the story. Again, we have to stress that points are people. They represent people. Not only the cultural period, but it's also the clans and ethnic identities within the cultural periods that are represented by highly stylized points within a type. You can take Kirk points, for example, or a better example would be dovetail points. If you look at the halves of dovetails, they differ. There are identities, ethnic identities, hidden, linked to those particular styles. We need that information. Overall, the type that a point is, you can ID the culture. You get into the styles within a particular type, then you can ID the clan or groups within that culture. And we can solve these really, really cold cases. A parting shot. Points are indeed personal, even today. I can remember coming home from work, and there was my dad sitting on my front porch, and I wondered, what's he doing here? It was late June. He should be cultivating soybeans. Well, he wasn't cultivating soybeans because that afternoon when he was cultivating soybeans, he looked over about 2 rounds, and he knew it was a piece of a point or something sticking out. He immediately stopped the tractor, went over there, and he couldn't believe how much was sticking out, and he thought it surely broke. He pulled it out, it's complete. And he said, oh, I can imagine what he said, but what he did was he poured out his afternoon worth of coffee, wrapped this late Paleo-Indian knife in his handkerchief, put it back in the thermos, and there he was sitting on my porch hours later with a big smile on his face. He handed me that thermos and said, here, open this up. I could not believe it. And there are so many stories like that within families where a find of a particular point or artifact has bridged together generations.